Forecasting is all about trying to consider what's going to happen in the future, but the future is not certain. And so there are various different options. For example, inflation could increase by 2% or 7%, and your costs and revenue could be drastically different based on that. And so it's important that you don't just forecast for one scenario, but you have various different scenarios and a form of scenario analysis in order to account for these variations. So how can we do that on Syft? Well, we can go and add several forecasts. You'll see I have a base case and a best case, and we're going to make some scenarios similar to that in this video. So it's very simple. You're just going to add a forecast. It's important to name it. So we're going to call it campus base case. I'm going to say base expectation. We're going to select the start and end date. We'll select the intervals exactly like you would for a normal forecast. We'll then click next. We'll base it on the last period using that data, and we'll click create. And so this is everything we covered in the basics budgeting and forecasting course. But now you've created this campus base expectation, and this would be a forecast based on your basic expectation. So perhaps you need to go and make some additional adjustments here. We could, for example, go say that we think consulting fees would increase by 5%. So we could go consulting fees. We think it's going to increase by 5% and click save. And now all our consulting fees will have increased. You can obviously go make several other adjustments to this base forecast. And when you're happy, you can go back to your dashboard. And then in order to create different scenarios without having to do a whole lot more work, you can go and duplicate this forecast. So we're going to click over here and say duplicate. And we're going to call this campus worst case. I'm going to say worst expectation. I'm going to click save. And now we'll have exactly the same forecast that we had previously built for this base case, but we can go make several adjustments to account for the worst case. So what happens if we aren't able to increase consulting fees by that 5% that we hope for? So perhaps consulting fees actually need to decrease. So we could go edit that adjustment and we could say it will actually decrease by 5%. And we'd say, well, what would happen in that case? We could perhaps consider if our other costs increase by 5% because this is the worst case, and go and adjust all the other lines that we need to in order to make this represent perhaps the worst case scenario for our business. We could then go back to the dashboard and open either the base or worst expectation. I'd suggest the base, and we could duplicate it again. I'm going to call this campus best case. I'm going to say best expectation. And now we could go record what we dream of, what we hope for. If everything goes well, what is it going to look like? And perhaps that's not just a 5% increase in consulting fees, but perhaps we're shooting for the stars and we want to have a 20% increase in consulting fees. We can click save, and now we'll see the impact of that. So now we have these three forecasts, our base, best, and worst case scenario, and we can go and inspect those and consider what our KPIs would be for each. And we can then use that to get insights into, what's reasonable. Here we have a gross profit margin of 95.9%. What is it when we look at the other ones? What are our costs? And we can use that as a process to consider the different scenarios and what the potential impact might be. This scenario planning is the same for a budget. So we could do exactly the same thing that we've just done here in a budget, and we can go have best and base and worst scenario or whatever you choose. And if you want to be able to compare them next to each other, you can always go to financials and to the profit and loss or balance sheet, and you can create a build P&L or build balance sheet. I'm going to call this forecasting comparison and click create. And now this build P&L will have been populated. And I can go and add these forecasting columns. So I can go add forecast and then campus base case next. I can select all the things that I want here. I can then go and add forecast or budget, campus best case, and again, make those decisions and click next. And finally, I can go and add forecast worst case and click next. Then I can go compare the difference between each of these cases for whichever month it's going to be. And then if I go look at a forecasted period, say November or December, I can then go and consider the difference between these three different scenarios. So we'll see that my consulting fees differ in each of them. My worst case is obviously the lowest, and there's my base and my best case. We could also add columns with equations, so we could see the value in terms of a currency value or even a percentage between these different cases. You can do this for your balance sheet as well. So it's a useful tool for you to be able to consider what happens if things go very well for my business or not so well or as I expect, so that you can be prepared for all alternatives. If things go as per your best case well, do you have a plan to make the most of any spare cash or income that you have? If things go badly, do you have a plan to get additional financing or to manage your cash better? And if things go as expected, well, are you going to achieve your goals? So these are all things that you should consider and some of the ways you can use Syft scenario planning to do that. The other far more simple way of scenario planning, and one that can be used for a specific adjustment within a greater forecast or budget, is that of toggling on and off specific adjustments. So in this forecast, we could go and click on consulting fees and go and see what that adjustment was and choose to either include it or exclude it. And if we include it, we can go consider what the impact of that is and how it will pull through. But then we can go and say, well, what happens if we're not able to achieve this increase of 20%? Well, then what would happen? So let's quickly go and consider some of the changes. If we could increase it by 20%, we'll note that our gross profit is 51,000. And if we go look at our KPIs, we'll see that, for example, our net profit margin is 85.7% in December. But if we go and say that we're not going to achieve this increase of 20%, we can toggle it off. And then we can go back to our profit and loss, and all of a sudden we see our gross profit is 48,000, so a little bit lower, and our KPIs might also have updated, but we'll note that our net profit margin is actually not impacted that much by it. And so that's interesting. We could go and consider what other factors could we do to improve or avoid such a decrease of our net profit margin. And so in this way, you can go and consider what the impact of these adjustments would be on some of the key metrics that you're considering, whether it's a total or in your KPIs. It's also important to consider the other aspects of this adjustment. So perhaps when we need to increase our consulting fees, that might mean that we also have to increase our wages. And so we might have added an adjustment here to increase the wages by 20% as well. It's important when you're doing these two-part adjustments that you name them in an easy to understand way, so that when you're going back and doing the scenario analysis, you can toggle all the relevant items on and off. So for example, I could come here and say, well, what happens if I don't achieve this 20% increase? Then I also wouldn't have to have this increase in my wages. And then I could go consider what the impact of my business would be. And so you'll note that I've named these similar things: increasing consulting fees part 1 and increasing consulting fees part 2. So obviously you could name it as you feel fit, but the purpose is here to go and consider the different options your business has. Should you focus on increasing your consulting fees, will it actually have such a big impact on your gross profit or your net profit? Or is there something else you should consider doing? Perhaps we could add a scenario to increase chocolate sales, and we might have to increase cost of sales then. So it's just the way for you to go and include these different adjustments in your forecast or your budget and consider what would happen if you were able to achieve them or not. And then you can decide what would be best for your business. This is obviously a relatively quick and simple way of doing scenario planning and really good for just different adjustments within a bigger forecast or budget. But if you want to create several different scenarios of an overall forecast or budget, you can do those base, best, and worst case scenarios like we did in the previous video.